You're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking from top academics at the University of Cambridge and beyond. Sanjay Joshi is the co-founder of Sogiv, a database of charities, analysing their impact and cost effectiveness. Sogiv helps donors make informed choices about where to donate and helps clarify how much of a charity's impact is attributable to each donation. Building on our conversations with George Rosenfeld and Eve McCormick, in this episode we discuss how Sogiv goes about analysing charities and their cost effectiveness, the difference in incentives and pressures between for-profit and non-profit enterprises, misconceptions about administrative costs and senior pay, as well as the challenges and opportunities of non-profit entrepreneurship. Here's the interview. So a few years ago you started Sogiv. Can you just tell me about the story that led up to that and what prompted you to start it?
So the genesis story of Sogiv is quite a difficult one because there's probably more than one origin story that I could tell, all of which has an element of truth to it. So let me just pick one of them and I'll give you that story. So I think you could start it very early. I think in 2010, I got a big pay rise moving from one job to another, and I was prior to that already being paid more than I needed to live, and that was a really big impetus for me to think about where I was donating for myself. And at the same time, I was working in finance, and my job was to analyze companies. And the thing that felt really missing to my mind was, we have this whole industry of people in finance who are analyzing companies. I want that to inform me when I'm donating. And I was looking really hard for it, and I didn't find it. So I was thinking about how I could apply the thinking that I'd seen in my day job to the charity sector. Fast forward a few years, I had by this stage, to inform my thinking, I had been a trustee of several organisations. I'd done pro bono consulting for several more, and I started Sogiv. And this started with a spreadsheet that I put together, just me in my living room, basically, sitting down and saying, well, if I wanted to ask these two questions, what would those answers look like for a bunch of different charities? And with the experience I had, I was able to find that information, and I just started typing it out one afternoon, and I thought, that's interesting. And then I nearly, I closed down the spreadsheet, and it said, "Do you want to save this spreadsheet?" And I thought, do I want to save this spreadsheet? And I'm glad to say I did, because if I hadn't, the world would probably be, my life at least would be a different place now. So that was the start of it. And then, lots of things happened since then. And now we've had over 100 different people have contributed to the volunteer analysis within the database. And we're moving something like £1 million per annum in terms of the amount of donations that come through the platform, and hopefully many more donations beyond that are influenced without coming through Sogiv. And we have a functioning web platform that has been used by a countless number of people, and the number of charities in the database, I lose track, certainly in the hundreds, probably the thousands by now.
And maybe in a bit more detail, could you just explain what Sogiv does nowadays?
So there's a few different users. Some of them are users who use the online platform. So this is events. So if your listenership is in the Cambridge University body, then you may be familiar with some of the events that are using Sogiv. The May Week Alternative, for example, event uses the Sogiv donation platform, and there are other events elsewhere as well. We are also have done some work with financial advisors. So the idea here is if a financial advisor looks after the money of their client, well, the client's donations are part of their money matters. And we've also developed a product for corporates as well to use to involve their employees in corporate giving. So those are the main areas. We've also flirted with a few other areas as well. So weddings, we have a wedding donation platform. This is if you are getting married and you already have, all of the crockery that you need. This is a pretty normal situation for people who have already lived together before they get married. A gift list might not be the most valuable thing for you. And so, those people might want to have a wedding registry that involves donations to charity instead. So we've developed that product and a few other gift-related products as well.
Sorry, I'll just. And you keep a database of the charities you've evaluated. Is that publicly available?
It is. At the moment, if you go onto the Sogiv website and have a look around, you will find all of that information. You can search for a charity. You can find most charities, not all of them. There are 200,000 charities in the UK, so we haven't got every single one of them, but we've got quite a lot of the big names. And you'll be able to see quite easily the answers to the two questions that Sogiv asks: how much does it cost for the charity to do a thing? Where we've been able to find that information, and what do you get for your money? Somewhat hidden away perhaps, but we do have write-ups of the analysis, and that's also available on the website.
So there are other charity evaluators in the world. I could mention GiveWell or Animal Charity Evaluators. These were established prior to Sogiv, I think I'm right in saying. So what does Sogiv do differently to these evaluators, or what do they do in addition to what, for instance, GiveWell does?
Sogiv is broader than GiveWell, and it's broader than Animal Charity Evaluators. GiveWell has an approach that's very focused on global health for good reasons. Animal Charity Evaluators focuses on animals for good reasons. Sogiv's approach is, let's start with the most popular charities and go through those, and then broaden that to cover as many other charities as possible, lots of small charities as well. And the aim here is to take our thinking, and our philosophy is not very different to that of GiveWell in terms of how we do analysis, but take that thinking and reach a broader donating public.
Okay, great. So we're going to talk about why we should care in the first place, about the impact that charities have, and about quantifying that. How Sogiv in particular goes about measuring those impacts, and also any challenges that you faced yourself in setting up and running Sogiv day to day. But we'll begin with talking about the motivation behind this. So I guess I'll start by asking, do you think people, for the most part, place much stock in the impact that their donations have? If they don't, then I'm curious to know why you think that is.
So it's an interesting question and a hard one to answer in the abstract. And the reason for that is that donor behavior is actually a really complex thing. So on the one hand, if you ask people a question phrased something like, when you're donating to charity, do you care about where your money goes and what it achieves? Almost everyone says yes. However, when you say, aha, people care about where their money goes and what it achieves, and then put in a huge amount of effort into creating a great big database that tells you exactly that, and then produce the answers of that for people, that starts to dichotomize the way that people respond. So some people respond with, wow, that's awesome, that really tells me something, and I'm really excited by that. And some people, sort of predictably, I guess, respond with, well, perhaps because of a sort of sunk cost bias, because they've already been donating to a particular charity for a long time, or for other reasons, the their actual interest in seeing real analysis on where their money goes and how much it achieves starts to fall apart. And I guess, to get to the heart of the question, sometimes people are really caring about this for what you might call consequentialist reasons, which means that when they're donating, they want to make sure that the money actually makes change and has impact. But they might be donating for entirely other reasons as well. It might be something like, my family or someone has benefited from something, and I'm donating not because I want to make a change in the world. I want to sort of say thank you or something like that. So there's a mixture of motivations when people are donating.
That's an interesting distinction that I hadn't thought about before. The difference between people's responses when explicitly asked about the extent to which they care about impact, for instance, and the preferences and values revealed through actual donor behaviour.
So it's very interesting to hear that, as you say, cost effectiveness is not the biggest thing, or maybe not the only thing that people care about when they donate. And then I guess the natural question to follow on from that is, do these differences matter? Is the impact between charities significant? And should this be something that we worry about?
So that's a great question. And I think when people hear about the Sogiv approach, they often assume that that the answer is that it doesn't matter. So let's just expand on that for a moment, because Sogiv cares about cost effectiveness, and that means that whenever looking at a charity, we almost always ask two questions. We ask, how much does it cost the charity to do something, and what does the beneficiary get for your money? And before looking at the data, a lot of people imagine that this might not tell us very much. They imagine that you'll see some charities which are cheap and have only a small amount of benefit, and other charities that do work that's more expensive but has a bigger amount of benefit. In fact, it's not as nice an outcome as that. And the reasons for that are incentives. So we actually see lots of charities that are relatively cheap, but actually have quite a lot of impact per pound donated, and other charities that do work that's really expensive, but have a small amount of impact per pound donated. And so this is a really, really weird thing, right? I mean, you would hope that there would be some kind of, if you don't mind me quoting Adam Smith, some kind of invisible hand somewhere that somehow magically makes sure that this doesn't happen. That, the invisible hand should tell us to somehow make sure that the cheap things have a small amount of impact and the expensive things have a big amount of impact. And that invisible hand isn't there. So why is that? And it's all down to the original question about incentives.
So can you elaborate a bit more about what incentives, I guess, kind of make the charity space so different, and means that there is this lack of a correlation between cost and impact?
So to answer that, put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who's running a charity. So imagine that, maybe it's a small charity and you've got a team of 5 people working for you, or maybe it's a big charity, it doesn't matter. And my question is, what do you need to do to make sure that you haven't failed at your job? Now, you might think naively that the answer is deliver good outcomes for the charity's beneficiaries. And in a sense, that to a certain extent that's true, and to a certain extent people will feel that, because I'm sure that people in the charity sector really are motivated to do good in the world. But also, to really make sure that you don't fail in a really visceral way, you don't have to actually achieve outcomes for your beneficiaries. All you have to do is to make sure that you've successfully fundraised to keep the team that's working for you in their job. So if we imagine now a charity which has got, on the one hand, the stakeholder that is the donor, and on the other hand, a stakeholder that is the beneficiary, that creates a world where the really important stakeholder is the donor. And so the sort of the incentives are the charities need to keep the donors happy. They probably want to also keep the beneficiaries happy, but the incentives aren't there to make sure that they really work at achieving that.
I guess the relevant contrast for some for-profit enterprise is that the funder and the beneficiary tend to be the same person, right? When you go and buy some goods, you benefit from having bought them, and you also fund these people by giving them your money. And I guess it becomes clear then that there's a clear incentive to manufacture these goods in a kind of effective or efficient way, because if you didn't do that, then you just lose out in competition. And I take it that the point you're making is that the fact that the funder and beneficiaries are separated, typically in the charitable space, means those incentives go away. Is that right?
That's exactly it. I do talk exactly as you say about this concept of funder-beneficiary separation, and the fact that funders and beneficiaries are not the same person is the root cause of the lack of invisible hand.
Now, when we talk about charitable effectiveness, lots of people like to emphasize the importance of minimizing overheads, in particular administrative overheads, and for instance, CEO pay and so on. And indeed, lots of charity evaluators also factor these things in quite highly. I want to know, is that a misguided way of evaluating charities, or is there something to it?
The short answer is yes, it is misguided. So 3 things that I think are potentially relevant to expand on here. One of them is why is it misguided? And that involves considering why is it tempting in the first place, and why is it actually wrong? A second one is let's try and steel man the overheads thing. Like, maybe it's useful in some scenarios. And the third thing is, let's dig deeper into why. So, why do people think this way? What are the deeper roots of that? So yes, it's a rich topic. Shall I start by talking about why people are interested in this metric in the first place?
Absolutely, that'd be great.
I think it combines a really appealing set of things. On the one hand, you want to make sure that there's some sort of sense of rigor that's gone into your decision. And if there's been some numbers somewhere, that helps to give this sense of rigor. Even if the numbers aren't necessarily helpful numbers, it's reassuring. And the other thing is that people have a real fear about being swindled. They have this real dislike of the idea that maybe they're going to, give their hard-earned money away, and then actually it doesn't go to the real cause. That maybe, and this people really don't like this. Maybe it'll go to someone who's actually better off than themselves, and that's really the root of what people don't like. And so that's why when people are talking about excessive overheads, often in the same breath, they'll talk about inflated charity CEO pay. They really don't like the idea that there are people working in charities who get these big 6-figure salaries, and they're saying, but these people are more rich than I am. So these things are all motivators for people. And so we tried to work out whether there's any kind of grain of truth in them. So maybe, the amount that's spent on the CEO salary could be material. and maybe it's a big deal. And so we looked into this, and for the largest charities, the amount spent on the salary of the CEO is somewhere in the range of 0.03% up to 0.15% of the overall charity spend. So, if you're thinking about, what's going to actually happen with your money, like if you care about results and if you care about the change that your money's making in the world, then if you're giving £10 and 3p of that is going towards the CEO salary, then it's possibly outside of the realms of materiality to get too worked up about it. And so at this stage, you might think, okay, but maybe I've just, rigged the numbers here because I just looked at the biggest charities. So I think looking at the biggest charities is sort of reasonable in that lots of people donate there. But let's try looking at smaller charities as well. So when we look at smaller charities, it's actually very rare to find the highest paid staff member being paid much more than about £60,000. So there is disclosure requirements in the accounts, and I think I'd struggle to even find an example that I know of where the charity is small and they're paid more than that. So this, if they're being paid sort of 45, 50, £55,000, this actually seems pretty reasonable for a senior staff member, leading a small organisation. I don't think that's unreasonable. So overall, it seems it's very hard to find a good evidence-based way of getting worked up about CEO pay. And lastly, on that topic, there's a group called NCVO, which is a charity sector body. And they did a review of senior pay in the charity sector, and they found that if you take a sort of a typical person in a moderately senior to very senior management role in a charity, they are on average getting paid 25% less than they would do for an equivalent role in the for-profit sector. So this is, I think, not surprising. That on balance, people are being paid a bit less because of the fact that they're in the charity sector.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe you're right that people are, on the whole, placing too much stock or worrying too much about CEO or senior pay. What about the point about overheads and administrative costs? That seems like something you want to minimize if you're a charity. Is that right?
In short, no. So there's more than one way of explaining this. So let's take one way of looking at it. Let's think of a charity. Let's imagine that you have a charity and it does counselling for children who've experienced trauma, for example. And let's find the element of that which counts as overhead. This is the bit that's in inverted commas the bad spend. So we look at the salary of the counsellor who's doing the actual counselling. That's going to the cause. That's definitely not admin. That's real, legitimate charitable spend. What about the rent for the room in which the counselling happens? Well, I mean, the counselling has to happen in a room. Like, they can't be under a tree or something. Like, it's legitimate core charitable spend to do that. And then what about the computer that the counsellor works on? Well, that's legitimate spend as well. And what about the boss for the person who is doing the counselling? Well, that's legitimate spend as well. And what about the idea that you've got to have somebody who's going to do the accounts so that we can review all of this stuff? Well, that's legitimate. I mean, we definitely want all of that. And then by the time you've gone through every single item of spend, you realise that either it is legitimate charitable spend that is going towards achieving the actual charity's goal, or they're just being fraudulent. So what we really realise is we don't really mind admin. Like, we want people to have things like, a toilet to go to if they needed to go to the toilet, or a room, or accounting. We want all of those things. What we don't want is fraud, and so it's actually a very different thing from admin spend.
Is there an analogy here to just plain old for-profit shopping? Why do people not care so much about administrative overheads when they're just buying things?
So this is a great question. The answer comes down, I think, to funder beneficiary separation, this concept that we were thinking about earlier. And so if you imagine that you are in Carphone Warehouse, for example, and you're buying yourself a mobile phone, imagine yourself in front of the salesperson in the shop, if I was in that position, I'd be asking two questions. I would ask, how much does the phone cost, and what do I get for my money? What I don't ask is, how much is Apple's CEO paid? I don't ask, how much does Samsung spend on overheads? This is not my problem. Instead, I leave that to them. I leave it to Apple. I leave it to Samsung to work out that problem, as long as they can deliver the bottom line. What is the overall cost to me as a consumer? And the key insight behind the Sogiv approach is to say that when we are donating, we are buying outcomes for beneficiaries. And so we want to do the same thing.
So far, we've talked about why cost impact is important and how there can be this great variation between charities. And we've also talked about why some, let's say, very simplistic indicators like admin overheads or CEO pays might be misguided. But before we talk about what Sogiv does instead, I just actually want to take a step back and maybe talk a bit about intentions. Because one thing that I'm very aware of is when I talk to people about why we might care about evaluating charities and how impactful they are, a lot of people, I think, are hesitant to have that conversation and to talk about auditing charities or looking at their impactfulness, because they feel it almost misses the point of charity, which is a very emotional action. And if I do some good, that's still good. So can you talk a bit more about why, or what kind of motivation or intent you have with Sogiv when you are evaluating these charities?
Sogiv is really all about emotion. It's all about heart. But people are emotional with their giving in different ways. So for me, and for the Sogiv approach as well, if we see that for a given amount of money, we can help 100 people, and for a given amount of money with a different charity, we can help one person, and assume that the amount of help per person is the same, then for us, it is a real matter of heart to look at all of those 100 people and say, nobody is a statistic. For us, it's a deeply emotional thing to say that, we want to make Stalin wrong when he said that one death is a tragedy and 1 million deaths is a statistic. We want to make a world where people are looking at all of those statistics and not dismissing them as not being real people anymore. We want to make a world where people see all of those statistics as real human beings or animals or whatever it is that matter. And that is the thing that motivates us and that drives us. And that is a deeply emotional thing. And, we also understand that there are different perspectives and people won't necessarily see it that way. And we're not going to try and change everyone. But we know that there are other people out there who feel the same way, and we want to serve those people.
I find that framing very interesting of kind of comparing different outcomes. And as you mentioned, when you ask anybody the question, would you rather save 100 lives or would you save one life for a given donation? I think that has a very clear answer when it's framed like that. But I do feel, when you talk about charity in normal terms or between normal people, it very rarely gets framed like that. It's always the question of, oh, do you want to save this person? Never really talking about what other options or what kind of trade-off or in economics terms, what opportunity cost there really is. And I do think that's something very interesting that's missing from the narrative a lot of the times.
Absolutely right. And I think this is why it felt so countercurrent for Sogiv to start thinking in this way when we set up the organization a few years ago. And I guess, what we're saying is the reality is, the sort of force multiplier of charities do vary. And for a given amount of money, different amounts of good will happen. And so when we are comparing lifeboats with malaria nets, it is not one lifeboat launch versus one life saved with a malaria net. It's one lifeboat launch versus several lives saved with malaria nets. And that change in framing is the way that we want to change the narrative in the charity sector.
So let's talk about evaluating charities then, and Sogiv's method. So you mentioned the malaria nets and the lifeboats example. Those are clearly two very different outcomes that require a lot of thinking to see what impact they have and what cost they have as well. And you've kind of hinted at this before, but how do you start your framework with tackling these very difficult questions?
So our analytical framework has two approaches. One of them is the broad and shallow analytical method, and the other one is the in-depth analytical approach. The broad and shallow approach can be summarized as the two-question method that I mentioned before. It involves asking, how much does it cost for the charity to do a thing? And secondly, what does the beneficiary get for your money? In truth, that could be used to summarize the in-depth method as well. However, the in-depth method typically involves much more tailored and in-depth analysis to really get to the heart of those questions.
So let's start with the shallow method first, and this two-question framework that you mentioned. So when we're talking about cost or benefit to the beneficiary, where do you look to find this information? Do you talk to people? Do you look for things in the internet? Do you look at research papers? Where do you start?
So ideally, we'd like to find the information in the public domain. We do also get the information by asking charities for it, but we do less of that because there's bigger overheads involved both for ourselves and for the charities as well. And so we've, I guess part of the reason why I was in a good position to found Sogiv is that I'd been involved with charities and charity accounting for many years prior to founding Sogiv, so I was well positioned to tease out this information from what's in the public domain. And we've, over the years, developed a method that involves looking at the information that's on the Charity Commission website, where you can get hold of the accounts, pick up the information, and put it into the Sogiv database. And that often, but not always, gets us the answers to the Sogiv two-question method.
So when we look at these two questions, costs seem almost very straightforward. That seems like, when you look at the financial accounts that you mentioned on the Charity Commission, they're almost legally required to mention these and to break these down accordingly. And then you can look at the different things that they spend money on. But impact seems a much, much harder thing to measure and to compare between as well. What kind of challenges do you face when you want to look at the impact that a charity has?
So let's start by introducing a concept here called the theory of change. Now, I don't want to take too much credit for this. The framework called the theory of change has actually been kicking about in the charity sector for many years and long before Sogiv existed. But we find it a useful approach, and so we leverage that. And a theory of change typically involves saying, what are the inputs into the charity's work? and this might be volunteer time, or it might be donors' money. And from Sogiv's perspective, we're interested in donor money. And then that leads to activities, which leads to outputs, and then the outputs lead to outcomes. And outputs and outcomes are charity sector jargon. So when I talk about outputs, what I mean are the direct effects of a charity's work. This might mean a lifeboat launch. It might mean a mile of cycle network maintained. It might mean a malaria net. It might mean a vaccination. But outputs are not typically of intrinsic value. We don't fund charities because of the intrinsic pleasure of having a needle stuck in a child's arm. We care about the knock-on effects of that work. These things are typically referred to as outcomes. So for those examples, we might fund lifeboat launches because we want lifeboats to save lives at sea, or do various other things, and we might fund miles of cycle network because we want people to cycle more and use cars less, and that might lead to ultimate impacts such as the impact on climate change or the impact on human health.
So how do you differentiate between these two things then, between outputs and outcomes? Do charities reliably report the outcomes that they achieve, or to what degree of confidence can you measure these things in the public domain?
I suppose the short answer is no. So there is no requirement on charities to state in the public domain their outputs or their outcomes. And this it seems kind of shocking in a way. You might think that that for many people, at least, charities exist in order to do good in the world and to make change and to achieve things. And so to have reporting that doesn't allude to this at all seems amiss. However, fortunately, in the UK, we do have that information being reported quite often, not because of any requirement to do so, but because charities often anticipate that people might be interested. Typically, this happens at the outputs level. Charities will often say, this is how many people we trained, this is how many people we reached, this is how many people we helped, this is how many malaria nets we distributed, that sort of level of information. They do not often include information at the level of outcomes. So they do not often say, this is the number of prisoners that received our training program, and also this is how many people then ended up not reoffending. That sort of outcome level information is not often there. Also, outcomes are hard. Assessing that is difficult, and we've also discussed earlier that the incentives aren't there to invest really hard in assessing those outcomes. So what that means is that where the information does exist, it's normally sensible to treat it with a certain level of skepticism.
Could you maybe give an example of when you looked at a particular charity using this framework, and did you come up with any surprising or counterintuitive results?
There certainly have been a range of results that we've seen across the many charities we've reviewed. I think the biggest surprise probably comes from the extent of the difference. So, for example, let's say that what you cared about was saving lives. There are some charities where the cost per life saved could be well into the hundreds of thousands of pounds, and other charities where that might be much lower. We might be looking at about £1,500 or £2,000 or so or £3,000 maybe to achieve a life saved or a life saved equivalent. This sort of range of differences was a big surprise for me. So if we maybe drill down into specific examples, I alluded to lifeboats earlier. If we look at the number of lives saved by the RNLI and divide that by the total cost of running RNLI's operations, we get to around £400,000. And so if we compare that to another organisation that saves lives, the Against Malaria Foundation, under suitable modelling, we get to a cost per life saved that's, to simplify the numbers, below £4,000. So there we've got this factor of 100 going on. I think that the surprising thing for me was not that there would be differences. I think that before embarking on the Sogiv enterprise, I expected that. I think we could have sat in our armchairs and realised all of the things about incentives that we discussed before, and we could have worked out without seeing the data that that we don't have market efficiency, that we don't have an invisible hand. But what I didn't realise, what did surprise me, is that the differences would be so big, that factors of 100 or even 1,000 or more would be a common feature when we do these comparisons.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, one worry you might have is that when you pick a particular metric, then you can compare outcomes quite straightforwardly across different charities operating in different areas. But when it comes to comparing impact in the general sense across different metrics, that begins to look a lot trickier. In particular, you might think it involves some kind of moral judgments or judgments about what is and isn't valuable. I want to know how you go about thinking about that, if at all.
So one of the things that helps with this is the fact that the differences are so big. So the fact that the differences are so big makes it easier to make those comparisons. So to take an example, if we compare one charity that provides a holiday for inner city children for the same cost as the cost of saving 2 lives, then does there exist a set of value judgments such that we place more value on an inner city child having a holiday than 2 children's lives saved? I mean, possibly, but I think that would be a pretty extreme tweaking of your value set in order to make that work. And so, actually making comparisons across very different outcomes becomes much easier. Another thing, though, is that it's not always that easy. So sometimes the comparisons are quite difficult. Here's another question. For the same money, would you rather save a life, or would you rather have 250 people have a subsidized trip to an art gallery? I mean, I think I know the answer to that question, but I don't think it's obvious, and I don't think everyone would necessarily agree on that one. So in order to back our work with yet more evidence and yet more data, we are about to perform some research. And so using some of the comparisons that come up in our analysis, we're going to put those to the people. So we're going to perform a survey, and we're going to ask people to do the very same comparisons that I've just described. And I think that for some of them, it seems pretty likely that everybody will agree that 2 lives saved is better than 1 child going on holiday. But for 250 trips to an art gallery versus 1 life saved, I don't think I know yet what the survey results are going to say. And that will tell us something that will be interesting and valuable.
So I think one of the worries that we might have with charity evaluators such as Sogiv is that because you're very focused on outcomes and being able to quantify the impact, is that you might gravitate towards those charities where that kind of information is available. And that means having a strong interest in things that we can measure, and we can only measure things that happen now or that happen on an individual measurable scale, such as how many lives do we save or how many people can we treat who have this disease. but other causes might be more intangible, like human rights or activism or research, that might in the long run have very big impacts when they do achieve their cause. But at the moment, we have no certainty about how much money they might need, how much funding, or how many lives they might save in the future.
At first glance, this is a reasonable concern, and one that has been raised many times. And I think in the early days of Sogiv, it had some merit. So when we were starting out, what do we do? We look at all of the charities that there are, and start gathering data and insights about them. I think at the moment, the stronger bias at the moment is less on the things that are measurable and more on the things that are popular. So, I think that a big part of what we do is look at what are the most popular charities and go through those. And actually, research charities are very popular charities, for example. And we also look a little bit at campaigning. It comes up quite often. So lots of things that are very hard to measure come up in what we do. And in the earliest days of Sogiv, our approach was to gather the data on the easiest to measure things. And for the things that were harder to measure, we simply observed this thing is harder to measure. And we left it at that. And as time has gone on, we've added more and more analysis to those. Harder to measure doesn't mean impossible to gain insight on. So with biomedical research, we have done some analysis where we look at the scale of the impact of the condition, and we compare it with the amount of spend that's happening. And our write-up on that takes into account what is the level of tractability within that particular cause area. So between all of those factors, we think that we can gain some insight on that, and we think it tells us something of great interest, and helps to actually sort the wheat from the chaff when we're choosing between those different organizations. So with the campaigning organizations, and again, campaigning is increasingly the sorts of organizations that we are including in our analysis. Leveraging in some cases the work of other partner organizations and sometimes work of our own. We have cost effectiveness models on campaigns, which involve looking at the cost of doing the work and comparing that with to what extent do we think that organization has brought forward the outcomes that it's achieved, looking at its historic results. So all of those things are things that, in fact, are within the purview of what we do. So in short, in the earliest days of Sogiv, we really did only focus on the most measurable things, and that's because we just started with the things that were most easy. And as time has gone on, we've expanded to cover more and more of the difficult to measure things as well. And that's because they're popular and people want answers on them.
So this is a very similar question, but as presumably some charitable interventions deliver their outcomes with really high confidence because the evidence is really available. Others deliver outcomes with much less certainty and lower confidence, but they potentially carry a far higher upside if they pay off, such that their impact might be comparable in expectation. Some people think the fact that you're less confident about that second option counts against it. And I'm curious whether you factor in uncertainty into your evaluation. Is the fact that you have lower confidence about a particular intervention something bad in itself?
I think that there's a really interesting question about risk appetite. And I think the short answer is that our modelling is risk neutral. There are two things, though, that sound very similar to each other, but are in fact different. So one of them is I am a risk-averse donor, and therefore I want to have higher confidence in the outcomes that I'm achieving. Another one is I'm a risk-neutral donor, but I'm also a skeptic about whether these things are going to have the outcomes that they claim. So if you are a skeptic, it often looks a lot like being risk-averse. And the reason for that is that as a skeptic, you might say that your sort of default assumption is that this charity is not achieving very much. And then you need a lot of evidence to move your opinion towards believing that it is having whatever it claims, be it in expectation or whatever. And so those are two different things. The Sogiv approach by default is we're often quite skeptical, but we are risk neutral. Sometimes we do work with individual major donors and we subject them to a values survey. And if we discover things about their risk appetite or about their level of skepticism, then we might adjust our recommendations accordingly. But for the default analysis, that is risk neutral but skeptical.
So far, we've talked a lot about the shallow analysis and the two-question method. I was going to ask as well, where does the deeper analysis fit into that? Under what situations might you want to do that, and what would that look like?
Normally, we'll only do deeper analysis when we've got serious donor interest in an area. So this might be, for example, if a major donor or a partner organization that's going to move a material amount of money, something like that, is interested in a particular question, that's when we would look into that in more depth. And the reason for that is partly a sort of marshalling our own resources, but also because we want to be considerate to the charities that we're talking to. In-depth analysis probably means that we're going to take up somebody else's time as well. And we really only want to do that if it's at least got a chance of being worth their while. So yes, that's the situations in which we would do the in-depth analysis.
Do you see some future out of interest where you start talking to people like GiveWell and animal charity evaluators and start centralizing or aggregating your findings?
I think there's a bigger question, which I don't think I quite know the answer to, about how much is it good for the world if people collaborate more so that we don't reinvent the wheel? And how much is it good for the world if people stay separate so that you can have proper independent review of the work that's been done by somebody else? And the sort of a bit of both has been happening in terms of how Sogiv relates to these other organizations. And so I don't think I know the optimal answer to that question.
So, as some listeners might know from our last episode with Eve, effective altruism's mission seems very similar in the idea of, on the one hand, there's this motto of doing good better, not just donating to charity because it does good, but donating to the most impactful charity. So for every pound given, you can have as much impact as possible. How does Sogiv relate to effective altruism, and where might you disagree with approaches or attitudes?
There's a big overlap between the Sogiv philosophy and the effective altruism philosophy. And, in some ways, one of the many origin stories that you could come up with for Sogiv is that I read Toby Ord's 2009 paper, The Moral Imperative Towards Cost Effectiveness. And I thought, what would be a startup organization that encapsulates that article, and I think that Sogiv is probably is that organization, and And for those of you who don't know the history of effective altruism, that paper was also very important in driving the effective altruism movement as well. So Sogiv and effective altruism share a love of cost effectiveness. I think maybe a difference perhaps is in thinking about cause prioritization. So one of the things that's very distinctive about effective altruism is that effective altruists rightly think that choosing between causes shouldn't be solely down to gut feel, but rather analysis and evidence can be used to help choose between different cause areas. So if you think of a cause area such as, I don't know, curing cancer or tackling climate change or whatever else, choosing between these needn't just be based on gut feel. It can be based on analysis as well. And this is something that that both Sogiv believes and effective altruism believes as well. The thing I'm about to say next is probably going to be disputed by some people in the effective altruism movement. Some people in the effective altruism movement would agree and others would disagree with this characterization of effective altruism. But effective altruism perhaps tends to focus more on those cause areas that it perceives to be the highest impact ones. And in a way, that makes sense. I mean, of course, you should focus most on the cause areas that are the highest impact ones. Sogiv, to a certain extent, follows this in that, where we are maybe working with a major donor and they're really looking to us for where are the highest impact cause areas, then we too would do that. Something that is perhaps a difference, maybe, is that we believe that lots of the analytical tools that we find so useful in coming to answers within the highest impact cause areas are also useful in the not as high impact cause areas as well. And we think that that's valuable, because it's not totally obvious that the highest impact cause areas really are the highest impact cause areas. And maybe some unexpected piece of new information will come up that means that the things that we think aren't the highest impact cause areas are in fact high impact for reasons that aren't so obvious. So you mentioned human rights, for example, and this is an area where Sogiv plans to expand our analysis, and maybe that's going to be really high impact for reasons that aren't immediately obvious. So that's one reason, and another reason is that even if the not highest impact cause areas really are not the highest impact cause areas, enabling people to do more good within those cause areas is still a good outcome. So all of those things are things that Sogiv thinks are interesting and valuable, and that's probably a difference between at least some in the EA movement.
I was waiting to hear something really controversial, Ben, and I'm sorely disappointed because that all sounded very reasonable. Let's talk about your experience starting a non-profit. I guess one question to ask is, having gone through this, what would you say or would you expect the major differences to be between starting a non-profit and some for-profit enterprise? Are there challenges that are unique to one or the other?
I think I'd differentiate between three types of startup. It's really coming down to funder-beneficiary separation in a way. So one of them is where the funder and the beneficiary are aligned. So this is a typical for-profit startup. Another one is a sort of traditional charity where you've got a sort of beneficiary goal or a beneficiary stakeholder that you're trying to optimize for, and you've also got a donor to keep happy. And then you've got the worst of the lot, which is the Sogiv model, and others as well, I imagine, where you've got three things that you're trying to keep happy. So one of them is, Sogiv has been funded in the past, so you have to, justify yourself to the funders of Sogiv. Then you've also got your impact goals of making the world a better place, and thirdly, you've got your clients. Those are the sort of the three categories that I would distinguish between. I think the sort of one of the biggest lessons from my experience with Sogiv is don't do that three-way approach that Sogiv did. It's just horrible. I mean, it's just really, really painful. So that's really, really tough. And just try not to do that ever, if possible. I think it's a much. I also have entrepreneurship experience outside of Sogiv, doing other things as well, and when your focus is like in a for-profit context, when your focus is entirely on, okay, we've got a potential client here, or we've got an existing set of users, and everything is aligned, everything is focused. We know what it looks like to make that client happy, and then we just do it, and all of our focus is on that. It's such a wonderful experience. It's just so much nicer. So much nicer than the tensions between having impact goals and keeping client happy goals, which won't always be aligned.
That's a fantastic tip there. Simplify the number of interests you need to satisfy. So that's one pretty major challenge it sounds like you faced. Were there any other big hurdles that you found yourselves tackling that you thought were unexpected or surprising in setting up Sogiv?
I mean, there were lots of hurdles, but I don't think they're very interesting ones. I think they're very sort of standard things that happen when you go through a sort of startup process. It was hard work getting funding, and there was lots of time and effort that went into that, and there was lots of difficulty and hard work as well around things like how do we find the right product market fit. So all of these things were difficult. Sometimes finding the right talent has been hard work. All of these things have been challenges for us, but I don't think that's a very Sogiv specific challenge. I think that lots of other entrepreneurs will say the same things.
So what piece of advice would you give to somebody who is also looking to be entrepreneurial, maybe in the non-profit sector? And especially, how would you help people decide between, setting up their own startup and joining an existing organization?
I think it's very important to raise that question. There is a term that you hear kicking about in the space sometimes, which is Heropreneurship. So it's this idea that you kind of sort of almost suggestive that there's an element of ego going on when people set up their own organization, and maybe if they'd simply worked within another organization, this might have been a better way forward. And I think that's a very valid concern that often arises. So if your listenership is largely people who are currently undergraduates or graduates or students at the moment, I think it's unlikely that they should want to go straight into entrepreneurship. So that could be different if, for example, maybe they've been doing a PhD and they've got some research and the research leads towards entrepreneurship. That might be a good way forward. But yes, if you're an undergraduate, I think it's unusual to have a good reason for going straight to entrepreneurship. Most likely, it's going to make more sense for you to do something for at least a few years and have some other experience, and then do it it's still, there could be still some good entrepreneurship, even when you're still quite young, even when you're still sort of 23, 25, these are still very young ages. And you can still do some stuff with a bit of experience. That's not a hard and fast rule. Doesn't mean that there's no good ways of doing good entrepreneurship, be it charity entrepreneurship or any other type of entrepreneurship when you're still an undergraduate. But you should at least start off with a skeptical default assumption or a skeptical prior.
I feel obliged to mention at this point that if you are curious about charity entrepreneurship, then there is a charitable startup incubator called Charity Entrepreneurship, which you might like to check out for more information.
And I was going to say as well, it definitely sounds as well from your experience that you've benefited from having this background in finance and this analysis and the skills you develop there as well. And I guess the perspective as well, right? To care about cost effectiveness and financial accounts and the like.
I think as well, I spent a couple of years as a senior strategy consultant, and that, as well as the finance experience, means that it's easier for me to have the right thinking tools to do a survey of the space before I enter it. And I think it's still possible to do this even as an undergraduate in principle, but you want to be able to conceptualize what is already happening in this space before you start creating something new in it. And if you can very clearly articulate, here's the gap, then it may still make sense for you to do that entrepreneurship.
So one very obvious question to ask now is, how can listeners get involved with Sogiv?
So we used to have a very easy model for getting involved as a volunteer analyst. We had events that happened twice a month. Anyone could pop in and take part and do some of the shallow analysis. We now have a new approach, partly triggered by COVID-19, partly triggered by Sogiv's evolution as well, where we recruit a smaller group of individuals to take part as longer-term volunteer analysts. And so listeners are very welcome to apply. The next time that this happens will probably be a good few months from now, because we only have a handful of intakes every now and then. But where somebody has a particularly good fit, because perhaps their educational background or something has is particularly useful for us, then we will accept those applications outside of our normal cycles, and they're welcome to send in a speculative application simply by emailing me on sanjay@sogiv.org.
Fantastic. So I think this might be the most important question of the interview, Sanjay. You are rarely seen without this famous red scarf, which you're wearing right now. I'm really curious to know, what's the story there?
I feel like I should have a better story. It makes me want to make up a story whenever I get asked this question. Like I'm part of a secret club, and everybody in it has a different coloured scarf. And if you've got a red scarf, it means you've killed someone or something like really, really exotic like that. But it's nowhere near as exciting as that, I'm afraid. It's really just that I originally started wearing it because I lived in Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is quite a chilly place. It's a very nice place, actually. But yes, if you're used to the sunny south of England, then I found myself wanting to wear a scarf in February, and then in March it wasn't warm yet, and then in April it wasn't warm yet, and then in May it wasn't warm yet, and then it sort of grew from there. As sort of I was wearing a red one at one stage, just because that's what I happened to pick up in a shop cheaply, and so yeah, it just started as a sort of running joke. Like, people were taking the mick out of it, saying, Sanjay, you're always wearing this red scarf. And then I was just enjoying the fact that there was this running joke. So I just kept on wearing it. And then it almost became a sort of part of the Sanjay brand, part of my identity. I'm always seen with this red scarf. So, we're not so active on Twitter, but there is a Sogiv Twitter handle, but my personal one is at Sanjay Red Scarf. My GitHub is Sanjay Red Scarf. So it becomes convenient now. If I want to be a distinctive Sanjay, there's many other Sanjays in the world, but not many Sanjay Red Scarf people.
So let's ask the final two questions we ask all of our guests. The first one is, what is a thing that you have changed your mind about?
I find this a difficult question because I struggle to find things where I've had a sort of clear changing mind moment. And it has happened. I suppose in a sort of prosaic sense, prior to Trump's election, I thought that the probability that he would be elected was 45%, and afterwards I changed that to 100%. So that's sort of sudden clear change of my mind. There's very little where I've actually clearly suddenly changed my mind.
And then the very last question, which is hopefully a bit easier to answer, is what are 3 books or articles or pieces of media that you would recommend to anyone who wants to find out more?
So one that I've mentioned, which was an inspiration for Sogiv, is Toby Ord's 2009 paper, The Moral Imperative Towards Cost Effectiveness. I found that actually quite easy to read. But if you want something more digestible, there are also other articles that take that content and make it a little bit easier to digest. Another thing that would be relevant if you're interested in Sogiv's work is Sogiv's blog. So Sogiv has a blog which is thinking about charity.blogspot.com. And lastly, you could sign up to be on the Sogiv mailing list. And so we are currently in the process of reviewing and rethinking how that works. But one of the things that we have been doing is doing a weekly roundup of what's happening in the charity news. And so we sort of identify things like, this is happening in the charity sector, or that's happening in the charity sector, together with a little bit of commentary that we think would be relevant from a donor's perspective, using the Sogiv mindset.
Sanjay, Joshi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Sanjay Joshi on evaluating charities and non-profit entrepreneurship. As always, if you want to learn more, you can read the write-up at hearthisidea.com/episodes/Sanjay. There you'll find links to the articles and resources Sanjay mentioned, as well as to the Sogiv website itself. If you found this episode interesting, you might also want to check out 2 of our previous conversations. Episode 11 with Eve McCormick and episode 8 with George Rosenfeld. As always, it would be great if you could leave an honest review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to this. If you have constructive feedback, there's a link on the website to an anonymous feedback form. Or you can send us an email at feedback@hearthisidea.com. Finally, if you would like to support the show more directly, you can also leave a tip by following the link in the show notes. Thanks very much for listening.